Hello everyone, welcome to the world behind midnight, where we illuminate the shadows that official reports refuse to acknowledge. Tonight's account comes from a classified operation that should never have existed. You want to know why I check every window lock 3 times before bed? Why the sound of wind through trees makes my hands shake uncontrollably? Let me tell you about the contract that paid more money than I'd seen in my life, and cost me everything that mattered. It started 5 years ago this December in the frozen heart of Alaska's interior, in a zone marked on federal maps as Restricted Access Zone Tango 7. The offer came through encrypted channels, $25,000 each for 2 weeks of what the documentation called advanced territorial pacification. My name is Kyson Preston, former Special Operations with a decade of experience in hostile environment reconnaissance and asset recovery across 3 continents. After my discharge, I built a reputation handling security consulting for energy companies and private research expeditions in remote locations where conventional law enforcement couldn't reach. When you've spent years working in places where backup is 3 days away by helicopter, you develop instincts about danger that most people never understand. The client presented themselves as Cascade Environmental Solutions, but everything about their operational security screamed federal involvement. Legitimate private contractors don't use military-grade encryption for basic communication or require biometric verification for preliminary meetings. The initial briefing took place in a sterile conference room in Anchorage, delivered by a woman in her 40s who introduced herself only as Director Reeves. She wore an expensive suit that looked profoundly out of place in Alaska, and her eyes held the particular emptiness of someone who'd authorized operations they couldn't discuss publicly. She explained that an unidentified aggressive predator was operating in a restricted wilderness zone, had attacked federal survey teams on 3 separate occasions, destroyed expensive monitoring equipment worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and needed to be permanently neutralized before the situation escalated further. The team they assembled wasn't your typical hunting party. There was Holden Mack, a former Army Ranger who'd worked private military contracts in Central Asia and spoke 4 languages fluently. He moved with the deliberate precision of someone who'd survived too many ambushes to ever relax completely. Then there was Ibrahim Thomas, a massive Nigerian immigrant who'd served in Marine Force reconnaissance and now specialized in wilderness rescue operations and heavy equipment recovery in extreme conditions. The man stood 6'5" and could carry 200 pounds of gear without breaking a sweat. Finally, there was Taylor Buckley, a 73-year-old Ethabuscan guide who'd been trapping and hunting in Alaska's interior for over 50 years. He knew the wilderness better than most people know their own neighborhoods, and when Director Reeves finished her briefing, he was the only one who looked genuinely disturbed, rather than merely cautious. The compensation should have triggered every alarm bell in my head. We were each receiving more than triple the standard rate for high-risk wilderness work, with half the payment transferred immediately to our accounts before we'd even seen the operational zone. When you're offering that kind of money, you're either dealing with something extraordinarily dangerous or something you desperately need to keep quiet. Looking back, it was obviously both. The equipment requisition confirmed Taylor's unspoken concerns about the true nature of our target. We were issued Accuracy International Arctic Warfare Magnum rifles chambered in .338 Lapua, weapons designed for extreme long-range precision shooting with enough stopping power to disable light vehicles. These weren't tools for hunting any known North American wildlife. Alongside the rifles, they provided custom-fabricated containment traps, manufactured from reinforced titanium alloy with hydraulic jaws capable of generating over 4 tons of closing force. The transport cage they showed us during equipment checkout made my blood run cold. The bars were 2 inches thick, welded from hardened steel, with a total weight exceeding 800 pounds. The interior dimensions suggested they were preparing to contain something roughly the size and strength of an adult grizzly bear, except the reinforcement pattern indicated they expected the target to possess problem-solving intelligence and opposable digits. Every piece of equipment screamed that we weren't hunting an animal in any conventional sense. Director Reeves avoided eye contact when Holden directly asked what species we were tracking. She simply repeated that the target was classified as an unidentified aggressive predator, and that our objective was elimination, not capture or study. Our insertion happened at dawn on a brutally cold December morning. The helicopter dropped us onto a narrow ridge overlooking a valley so remote it didn't appear on civilian topographic maps. The moment the rotors faded into the distance and silence settled over the landscape, something felt fundamentally wrong. It wasn't the normal quiet of wilderness, the subtle background noise of wind moving through branches and small animals moving through underbrush. This was absolute silence, a complete absence of natural sound that made every breath and footstep feel obscenely loud. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the entire valley was holding its breath. Taylor noticed it immediately, his weathered face tightening with an expression I'd seen on combat veterans who'd walked into kill zones. Something had cleared this valley of all normal wildlife, and we were walking directly into its territory. We found the first evidence less than 6 hours into our trek. It wasn't the bare sign that Director Reeves had vaguely mentioned in her briefing. It was a massive bipedal footprint pressed deep into half-frozen mud beside a narrow creek, measuring nearly 22 inches from heel to toe, with 5 distinct toe impressions showing clear articulation. The depth of the impression indicated something weighing close to 900 pounds, and the stride pattern showed a walking gait approximately 7 feet long. No known North American mammal leaves tracks like that. Holden knelt beside the print for several minutes, measuring and photographing from multiple angles, his face growing increasingly pale. "The weight distribution is wrong," he muttered, more to himself than to us. "This isn't a bear walking upright temporarily. This thing's primary locomotion is bipedal, the heel strike pattern, the toe spread for balance. Everything about this print suggests something that walks on 2 legs constantly." The trail led us deeper into the valley, moving in a perfectly straight line that completely disregarded natural obstacles. Whatever had made these tracks had simply walked through dense thickets of spruce and alder that would have forced any normal animal to detour around. We found places where the creature had casually pushed aside fallen logs weighing several hundred pounds, leaving them scattered like children's toys. The casual display of strength was more disturbing than any aggressive behavior would have been. Then we discovered the tree break. A spruce trunk nearly 12 inches in diameter had been snapped cleanly about 9 feet off the ground. The wood twisted and splintered in a way that suggested tremendous rotational force rather than a clean break from wind or decay. Ibrahim examined the breakpoint carefully, running his massive hands over the shattered wood. "You'd need hydraulics or explosives to do this," he said quietly. "I've seen structural steel beams that failed cleaner than this tree. Whatever did this wasn't using tools or leverage. It just grabbed and twisted until the wood gave up." Holden tried the satellite phone when we reached a rocky outcrop with clear line of sight to the southern sky. He reported our findings with clinical military precision, describing the tracks, the impossible damage to vegetation, and the unnatural silence that pervaded the entire operational zone. The response came after a long pause, Director Reeves's voice crackling through encrypted channels with unmistakable tension. "Continue with primary objective," she stated flatly. "Eliminate the target using approved methods. Do not attempt field recovery of biological samples until after confirmed termination. Do not deviate from your mission parameters." When Holden pressed for clarification about the target's classification, asking directly whether we were dealing with an undocumented species of primate, the line went dead. The silence that followed was answer enough. They knew exactly what we were hunting, had probably known for years, and they'd sent us in with just enough information to be effective and not enough to refuse the job. We pushed forward into the head of the valley as afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow. That's when the smell reached us, carried on a sudden shift in wind direction. It was overwhelming, a nauseating combination of wet animal fur, concentrated musk, and something that reminded me uncomfortably of human body odor mixed with decaying organic matter. The stench was so powerful it made breathing difficult, clinging to the cold air like a physical presence. Ibrahim actually gagged, turning away to compose himself, and this was a man who'd worked recovery operations in extreme conditions without flinching. This wasn't the natural scent of any mammal I'd encountered in a decade of wilderness work. It was alien and aggressive, a smell designed to mark territory and warn intruders in the most primal way possible. The den site appeared suddenly as we crested a low ridge, a natural clearing beneath an overhang of ancient spruce, the ground trampled flat in a circular pattern approximately 40 feet across. The area was littered with bones, hundreds of them, ranging from small rodents to what looked like caribou femurs, all systematically cracked open to extract marrow. At the center of the clearing was a massive depression lined with gathered spruce boughs and moss, forming a nest easily 10 feet in diameter. But what stopped us cold wasn't the nest itself. It was the way the bones were organized into distinct piles by size and species, suggesting not just intelligence but deliberate categorization. No animal does that. Animals scatter bones randomly, driven by instinct and hunger. This looked like a collection, like someone was sorting and studying their kills. Taylor stood at the edge of the clearing, his weathered face drained of color, muttering something in Ethabiscan that I couldn't understand. When I asked him to translate, he just shook his head slowly. "My grandfather told stories," he said quietly. "Stories about the tall ones who live in the deepest places. Stories about why you never hunt alone in certain valleys, why you leave offerings at certain trees." I thought they were just stories to keep children from wandering too far from camp. I was wrong. His hands were shaking as he gripped his rifle, and I realized with growing dread that Taylor had recognized this site immediately, that his people had known about these creatures for generations, and had learned to coexist through respect and avoidance. The sound came without warning, shattering the oppressive silence. It started as a low rumble that vibrated through the frozen ground beneath our boots, resonating in our chests like standing too close to massive speakers. Then it rose in pitch and complexity, becoming a vocalization that defied easy description. Part roar, part scream, but with modulation and articulation that suggested language. Emotional content, rage, and territorial aggression broadcast across the valley with deliberate intent. The sound was close, impossibly close, echoing off the surrounding ridges from what seemed like multiple directions simultaneously. Holden and Ibrahim immediately dropped into defensive positions, rifles up, scanning the tree line with the automatic precision of men who'd survived ambushes through constant vigilance. Taylor froze completely, his face gone pale, his lips moving in what might have been prayer. Then it emerged from the shadows on the far side of the clearing, and my brain struggled to process what my eyes were seeing. The creature stood at least 9.5 feet tall, covered entirely in shaggy dark brown hair that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, easily 4.5 feet across, and it moved upright with a fluid grace that defied its massive bulk. The head was distinctly humanoid in structure, but larger, with a pronounced sagittal crest and a face that combined ape and human features in a way that violated every expectation. But it was the eyes that froze me in place. They weren't the blank staring eyes of an animal. They held intelligence, awareness, calculation. This thing was studying us with the same analytical precision we'd been using to study its tracks. It wasn't just aware we were in its territory. It knew we were a threat, and it was deciding what to do about us. For perhaps 10 seconds, we stood in perfect stillness, predator and prey locked in mutual assessment. Then the creature took a single deliberate step forward, and the spell broke. Holden's rifle cracked twice, the sound deafening in the confined space. I saw the impacts, dark eruptions of blood and tissue high on the creature's chest. It roared, a sound of surprise and pain that was heartbreakingly human in its emotion, and staggered backward. Ibrahim fired next, a controlled burst of 3 shots center mass. The creature dropped to one knee, its massive hand clutching at the wounds, dark blood spreading across its chest. It looked directly at me, and in that final moment, before Taylor's shot punched through its skull, I saw something in those eyes. Not animal panic, but recognition. Understanding that we had come here specifically to kill it. The creature fell forward, the impact shaking the frozen ground, and lay still. The silence that followed our shots was worse than the creature's roar. We stood over the body, breathing hard, adrenaline flooding our systems with post-combat shakes. The creature was even more massive up close. its hands larger than dinner plates with fully opposable thumbs and palms that showed clear dermal ridges like human fingerprints. Its feet were broad and flat, perfectly adapted for bipedal locomotion across rough terrain. This wasn't some undiscovered bear species or deformed primate. This was something that fell into the gap between human and ape, something that shouldn't exist according to every scientific classification we'd been taught. Ibrahim knelt beside the body, his hand hovering over the massive chest without quite touching. "We just killed something that probably understands what death means," he said quietly. "Something that probably had a name, a family, a place and a social structure we don't understand." Before anyone could respond, a new sound echoed through the valley. It started low, a mournful wailing that rose and fell with the cadence of genuine grief. It was unmistakably a response to the creature's death, a vocalization of profound loss that transcended species boundaries. Then came the calls, not one voice, but at least 7 distinct vocalizations, echoing from multiple directions in the surrounding forest. They were coordinating, communicating, moving with purpose. The creature we'd killed hadn't been alone. Its family, its community, whatever social structure these beings organized themselves into, they were out there, and they were coming for us. We ran. All tactical training and operational protocol dissolved instantly into pure survival instinct. We crashed through the forest, abandoning stealth entirely. Our only thought to put distance between ourselves and the site of our terrible mistake. But even our panicked sprint couldn't match the speed of our pursuers. We could hear them paralleling our course, moving through dense timber that should have been impossible to navigate at speed. They were breaking branches deliberately, snapping thick wood with sharp cracks that echoed through the valley like gunshots. It wasn't random pursuit. They were flanking us, driving us like wolves herding prey, demonstrating tactical coordination that made a mockery of any assumption that these were simple animals. The intelligence behind their pursuit was undeniable and terrifying. We scrambled up a steep rocky slope, hands and knees clawing at frozen stone, heading for a cave entrance that Holden had spotted on the topographic map during our initial mission briefing. The climb was brutal, taxing our already exhausted bodies to their limits. Taylor struggled desperately, his 73-year-old frame pushed beyond reasonable endurance. Ibrahim grabbed him bodily, half carrying the old man up the final pitch as rocks skittered down behind us. When we reached the cave entrance and collapsed inside, gasping for breath, we could see them below. Dark, massive shapes moving through the fading twilight, positioning themselves around the base of the cliff with clear strategic purpose. There were at least 8 of them, varying in size from slightly smaller than the one we'd killed to one enormous individual that must have stood 11 feet tall. They moved with silent coordination, surrounding our position without any apparent vocal communication. The cave provided temporary refuge. It extended back into darkness for perhaps 30 feet, with a narrow entrance we could theoretically defend. We set up a defensive position, rifles trained on the opening, waiting for an assault that never came. Instead, around midnight, we heard a new sound, the grinding scrape of stone on stone, followed by low rumbling vocalizations that clearly carried meaning between multiple individuals. Holden crawled to the entrance and peered through a gap in the rocks. What he saw drained the color from his face. The creatures below were systematically moving an enormous boulder up the steep slope, working together with clear understanding of leverage and coordinated effort. They weren't attacking us. They were sealing us in, with methodical purpose that spoke of intelligence and planning. They maneuvered the massive stone into position against the cave entrance. The boulder was enormous, easily the size of a small car, weighing several tons. Moving it should have required heavy equipment, but these creatures handled it with nothing but raw strength and coordination. Within an hour, they'd completely blocked the entrance, leaving only tiny irregular gaps where rocks didn't meet perfectly. We were trapped in absolute darkness, and the finality of it crashed down with suffocating weight. They weren't going to kill us directly. They were going to let exposure and dehydration do it for them. It was efficient, it was final, and it demonstrated a sophistication of revenge that was profoundly disturbing. The next 5 days were psychological torture beyond anything I'd experienced in combat zones. We were sealed in absolute darkness, the air growing increasingly stale as our limited oxygen was slowly depleted. Our water ran out after 2 days, and the dehydration set in with brutal efficiency. Taylor deteriorated rapidly, his elderly body unable to cope with the extreme conditions. He slipped in and out of consciousness, muttering in Athabascan about spirits and violations of ancient agreements. Ibrahim and Holden suffered from constant headaches and emotional volatility, their combat training providing no defense against the slow certainty of death by entombment. We were too weak to attempt moving the boulder, too exposed to risk firing our rifles and potentially triggering a collapse or drawing a coordinated response. We simply lay in the darkness, waiting for the end that seemed inevitable. On the 5th day, the sound returned. The grinding scrape of stone, closer than before, vibrations traveling through the cave floor. We could barely whisper, our throats raw from dehydration, but we crawled to the entrance with desperate hope. They were moving the boulder, slowly and carefully, creating a gap barely wide enough for a human body to squeeze through. It was a deliberate act, precise and controlled. They weren't releasing us out of mercy or compassion. They were allowing us to leave their territory now that we'd been sufficiently neutralized as a threat. The message was clear in its simplicity. You came here to kill us. We contained you, demonstrated our superiority, and now we're granting you permission to leave. Do not return. We emerged into cold daylight, weak and disoriented, blinking against the painful brightness after days of absolute darkness. Ibrahim helped Taylor through the narrow gap, the old man barely conscious, his breathing shallow and irregular. As I crawled out last, I saw it. Standing approximately 60 yards away at the tree line was another massive creature, perhaps the largest we'd seen, watching us in complete silence. Its eyes reflected the afternoon sun with an unnerving golden luminescence. It made no aggressive move, but its presence was a statement of dominance and warning. It vocalized once, a low rumbling sound that carried unmistakable meaning despite the language barrier. Leave now, and do not come back to this place. We fled down the slope, half running and half falling, heading toward the sound of running water. We reached a partially frozen stream and collapsed on the banks, drinking desperately. The cold water, painful in our raw throats, but necessary for survival. We were alive, barely, but broken physically and psychologically. Taylor was unconscious, his pulse thready and weak. Ibrahim and Holden could barely stand. We needed medical evacuation immediately, but the satellite phone had been left in our gear outside the cave. We were 40 miles from the nearest human settlement, in sub-zero temperatures, with no equipment and no way to call for help. The situation was desperate, and it was about to get worse. The vocalizations erupted from the forest again, closer than before. Multiple voices calling and answering from different directions. They weren't pursuing to kill. They were driving us, hurting us, toward the boundaries of their territory with clear intent. But Holden and Ibrahim, their judgment impaired by dehydration and trauma, interpreted it as an attack. The combat instincts that had kept them alive through multiple deployments kicked in, overriding reason. Holden scrambled for his rifle, checking the magazine with shaking hands. "We make our stand here," he rasped, his voice barely recognizable. "We fight our way out. They let us go because they thought we'd die in that cave. We proved them wrong." I tried desperately to reason with them, explaining that the creatures had demonstrated clear, non-lethal intent. They'd sealed us in the cave, but left gaps for air. They'd opened the entrance when we were sufficiently weakened. They were escorting us out of their territory, not cornering us for slaughter, but fear had completely obliterated rational thought. They were preparing a defensive position, using the stream bank for cover, ready to open fire on anything that moved in the tree line. I looked at Taylor, unconscious and dying on the frozen ground. I looked at my two companions, their faces twisted with terror and determination, and I made the decision that would define the rest of my life. I placed my rifle carefully on the rocks beside Taylor's body. I stepped into the freezing stream, letting the shock of cold water focus my thoughts, and I ran. I ran upstream, away from the defensive position, away from my team, letting the rushing water mask my scent and the sound of my movement. I heard Holden shout my name, a raw cry of betrayal and fury, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I knew what was about to happen, and I couldn't be part of it. The gunfire started perhaps 2 minutes later. Rapid panicked bursts of rifle fire, the distinctive crack of the Accuracy International rifles echoing through the valley. Then, the roars, multiple voices, closer than before, answering the aggression with their own fury. The shooting grew sporadic, desperate, then abruptly stopped. Only silence remained. I ran for 3 days, following the stream course, moving only during daylight, hiding in whatever cover I could find at night. I ate nothing, drank from the stream when necessary, and kept moving with mechanical determination. On the 4th day, I stumbled onto an old mining road and collapsed in the middle of it. A geological survey crew found me 6 hours later, suffering from severe dehydration, frostbite on my feet, and near-complete psychological breakdown. They transported me to Fairbanks, where I spent 2 weeks in hospital undergoing treatment for exposure and trauma. The authorities questioned me extensively. I told them we'd been contracted for wildlife survey work, had become separated during a storm, and I'd been forced to navigate out alone. I never mentioned the creatures, the cave, or the truth about what had happened to my companions. Who would believe a story about 9-foot hominids who practiced sophisticated revenge by sealing humans in caves, then releasing them as a demonstration of superiority? The official investigation concluded that Holden, Mack, Ibrahim Thomas, and Taylor Buckley had died from exposure and wildlife predation in a restricted wilderness zone. Their bodies were never recovered. Director Reeves and Cascade Environmental Solutions disappeared completely. Their offices abandoned, their corporate registration dissolved. The entire operation had been designed to be deniable from the beginning. I was alive, and the weight of that survival, the abandonment of my team, the knowledge of what we'd done and what had been done to us, became a burden I carried every waking moment. I spent years trying to rationalize the experience, convincing myself they were an undocumented species of great ape, or an isolated population of Denisovans who'd survived in North America. But the tactical coordination, the strategic thinking, the clear communication, and social structure, everything pointed to something more complex than any ape. I live in Seattle now, working a safe office job managing logistics for a shipping company, as far from wilderness as I can get. I sold all my outdoor gear, donated my rifles to a collector's auction, and I haven't set foot in a forest since. The thought of being surrounded by trees makes my hands shake uncontrollably. I know what exists in the deepest wilderness, know that there's an intelligence out there that doesn't fit into our scientific categories, or our cultural understanding of what's possible. We killed one of them, and for that transgression, 3 men died. I survived because those creatures made a conscious choice to demonstrate mercy after proving their dominance. That's not animal behavior. That's ethics, morality, sophisticated cultural rules about appropriate response to threats. Sometimes late at night when the city is quiet, I hear sounds that shouldn't exist in an urban environment. A low, rumbling vocalization carried on the wind, or the crack of breaking wood that's too loud and too deliberate to be accidental. It's impossible, I know. These creatures live in the deepest wilderness, hundreds of miles from any city, but the feeling persists, that sensation of being watched by calculating eyes, of being studied and judged. I survived a government-sanctioned extermination mission because the target of that mission chose to show restraint and intelligence rather than simple revenge. That's a debt I can never repay, and a truth I can never publicly acknowledge. You don't have to believe my account. But if you ever venture into truly remote wilderness, if you feel the unnatural silence and the weight of invisible observation, remember what I've told you. The deep forests are never empty, and the things that live there are far more aware of us than we are of them. If you've listened to this story and felt the shadows pressing closer, if you understand now that the boundaries between known and unknown are thinner than official narratives admit, then subscribe to The World Behind Midnight. We illuminate the truths that hide in darkness, the accounts that can't be explained away or dismissed. Stay vigilant, question everything, And remember that sometimes the most terrifying stories are the ones that actually happened. Until next time, this is the world behind midnight, where reality is stranger and darker than any fiction.